In the mic, is that better? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to speak. I might mention that I made it a little easier for me to make a presentation because the war was so long ago that most of you people weren't even around. And secondly, those that were probably have forgotten the facts like I've forgotten the facts. So if I make any big mistakes, you'll understand. The war was somewhat unusual in many ways, but one way that it was really unusual was in the names that it was called. President Truman was a war veteran himself, an Army veteran, and he knew that this was a war, but he refused to call it a war. He called it a police action. And the reason for that being that he just didn't want to go into another war again, just 5 years after we lost 605,000 service personnel during World War II. But he also knew that something had to be done. And so he called it the police action, which to most Americans meant the police will go in and arrest someone and then that's taken care of. But that isn't the way it was. It was also called the Korean conflict, not the Korean War, but the Korean conflict. And that indicated that it wasn't really a real war. And it was also, by many of you know, it was called the Forgotten War because people really wanted to forget about this war before it even started. And unless you had a loved one or a relative like a husband or a son or a brother in the war didn't mean much to you. And so it was forgotten. And as soon as they finally had a peace, not a peace, but a ceasefire in the war, then people completely forgot about it for many years. And it was called different names by different countries. North Korea called it the War of the Fatherland to reunite Korea. China called it the War of against U.S. aggressors to save Korea. And South Korea simply called it 625. 625, very similar to what we call 9/11. Meaning that was the date that the North Koreans attacked South Korea. 6/25, meaning June 25th, 1950. On that date, some 75 to 100,000 troops from North Korea swarmed into South Korea. And this map here just shows a little bit about the peninsula. This is a picture of the Korean Peninsula. On the west side of the peninsula, you see the Yellow Sea, and across the Yellow Sea is China. On the north, we have the Yalu River, and across the Yalu River is China. There's a small little strip that actually where Korea actually meets Korea. So there's a small border there on the northeast side, and then on the east side there's the Sea of Japan, and down below one of its nearest neighbors is Japan. So it gives you an idea of the land. The next slide just shows a picture of the way it was pretty much divided after the war, and with North and South Korea. You see the Seoul just a short distance below the border, and that's the capital of South Korea. And up a little north you see Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea. When the North Koreans came into Korea, it was just a short time before they captured Seoul because it was so close to the 38th parallel. And then they started moving south. President Truman became very concerned about this, so he asked for a special meeting of the UN Security Council and proposed a resolution that said this action is in direct violation of the covenants of the United Nations, and so he asked for some action there, some UN action. Russia had veto powers, but for some reason they didn't actually use them. At the meeting, they just abstained from voting. Everybody else voted in favor of this resolution, so we created a UN force to try to stop this aggression. Before long, after the North Koreans took Seoul, they started moving down throughout the whole peninsula, and they actually divided into 4 fronts, and were just going down with actually facing very little resistance to the South Koreans, who were not near as well equipped. The North Koreans were equipped with Russian tanks, Russian trucks, Russian artillery, and all military hardware needed to conduct the war. So the South Koreans just weren't able to hold up. We noticed that before long, by the time the UN forces got there, the South Koreans were pushed down into that little corner down in the southeast corner of the country, and that's where we were when the UN forces got in there. When the UN forces, which consisted of 16 countries that sent in troops and 41 other countries that sent supplies and aid, with the U.S. carrying the brunt of the force. In fact, over 90% of the troops that served in Korea were U.S. servicemen. I mean, 90% of the UN troops that served in Korea. And so you can see where it was. And as soon as the U.S. Army and the UN troops got into the Chosin perimeter, which they called that little area in the bottom, then the tide changed and we started pushing them up north. And they went up north very fast because we had such superior firepower, especially the U.S. Army, and that the North Koreans were no match for the UN forces. So they went back up north very, very quickly. At about that same time, General MacArthur, who was the commanding general of all U.S. forces, decided it would be a good idea if we would have an amphibious landing up as far north as we could go and still be in South Korea. So he decided to, where that little blue arrow up on the top indicates Incheon, and he decided to make a landing at Incheon. There were some problems that occurred there that we didn't expect to begin with. And one of them was the extreme tidal changes that they have in the area along that Incheon area. It was not unusual at that time of the year for the tides go from a very minus tide to a very positive tide in one tidal change. So that meant that troop transports that were coming in to offload the troops had to get in, offload the troops, and be out of there in one tidal change. And that was very difficult because of the number of... This is a picture of one of the troop transports. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see right here, but you can see the troops standing up on the upper deck, and down below you can almost see the 3 or 4 of the nets, or the ladders that we would go down on. And in the rough seas and so on, it was pretty difficult to go down on. And the first Marines down had to pull the nets out as far as they could so that they wouldn't bash up against the troop transport and pin somebody's legs in between the troop transport and the landing craft. it was also quite a heavy net, and with the troops coming down with their backpacks and their rifles and their ammunition and rations and everything, clothing and everything else that they were going to be carrying for some time, they were very heavy loads, and so it was quite difficult to get down that ladder. And if any of you have ever made a landing, you realize, you probably remember that when you're going down one of these ladders, you put your feet on the horizontal strands of the net, and you hold the verticals in your hands so that somebody isn't stepping on their hands when they're coming down the net. This is a picture of a loaded craft getting ready. You'll notice several other crafts, landing craft, getting ready to make a landing. They get into formation, and then the first wave is ready to come in. And when they were all in line, which was kind of all of them parallel to the beach, then they made the run. They started to make the runs. The lead coxswain and the number one boat on the first wave would give the signal, and then they all head towards the beach. One other problem we had there was because of the extreme tidal changes, Korea has a big seawall along the west coast of Korea, and in order to get to that seawall, liking back to World War II, when troops would go ashore, the coxswain would drive his landing craft as far as he could, drop the ramp, and the Marines would run off and disperse as fast as they could. Well, in this particular case, we couldn't drop the ramp. We had to go up against the seawall and then put a ladder up and go up over the ladder. That made it difficult because this is typical of one of the ladders. And when the North Koreans would see a ladder go up over the top of the wall, they knew that somebody was going to be following, and so they'd zero in on that ladder and he'd shoot them, and many Marines didn't make it over the top. In fact, the first wave, very few did. And you'll notice there's, in this picture, there's 2 or 3 Marines here that have been wounded and fell back down into the landing craft. And another picture of another wounded, and I've showed this one because in the background, in addition to the wounded Marine that's being treated by a foreman, there's a pile of dead Marines that didn't make it over the ladder. But if you have enough landing craft, and this is true in any amphibious landing, if you have enough landing craft, you have enough Marines, and enough ladders in this case, some of them make it over the wall and get themselves into positions where they can start returning fire and try to make suppressive fire so that it makes people stop shooting or makes them put their heads down for a while, and then gives the Marines a chance to go over the wall and get it tied up. Now, I don't mean to say that this landing was anything like Iwo Jima. It was probably a cakewalk compared to Iwo Jima, but it was pretty hectic for a while. For the first 3 or 4 hours of the battle, it was very difficult. But we finally made enough troops in the land, and I think that within 3 or 4 hours, we had our beachhead kind of established. And in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days, with the troop transports coming in only at high tide and getting back out, we were able to offload the entire 1st Marine Division of 15,000 men in about 4 or 5 days, and that includes all the equipment, the supplies, tanks, trucks, everything. And once they were on shore, we really started moving. We were able to push the North Koreans back 5 or 6 miles a day, and in just a few days we were on the outskirts of Seoul, which was our first objective. This is a picture taken of a city block in Seoul, and it just seemed like you see it had been taken now by the North Koreans, and now we're taking it back. And this happened 4 times during the Korean War, so the Korean Seoul was just in ruins by the time the war ended. We used the Marine tanks to come in. Some of you veterans that fought in Vietnam or Desert Storm or Iraq or Afghanistan know how tricky house-to-house fighting can be, because there just seems to be no one way. The enemy can be shooting from around the corners of the building, from the rooftops, from windowsills, from doors and everything. And so it becomes very dangerous and very slow moving, especially if you have several buildings where fire is coming from. This is a picture of the palace that's right in the center of Seoul. This is a palace of a benevolent king that lived 300 or 400 years ago, and the people loved him so much that they kept his palace, and it was just a beautiful place before the war. You can see the roof was hit by a mortar shell or something. The palace grounds were a mess. The buildings in the palace grounds were just completely knocked to pieces. And this was the command post for the Marine Division, because it was right in the heart of Seoul, so they could control what was going on during the battle. Before long, we had that secured, and by this time, the U.S. Army and the other UN forces were almost up to the same point, so we joined forces and moved up towards the 38th parallel. We were told that we're going to stop when we got to the 38th parallel, but it just didn't work out that way. When we got there, we were told we were going to push on and go as far into North Korea as we had to win the war. This is a picture of South Korea. You notice the line here for the 38th parallel, and that's about where we were when we were told to continue on over the 38th parallel. At that time, the Marines were told to pull back and go back aboard ship. So we went back to Incheon, went aboard ship, and sailed down around the southern part of the tip of Korea, went past the Pusan, what had been the Pusan perimeter, and everything went well until we get to the 38th parallel. Then one of the lead transports noticed a mine, and we found there were hundreds and hundreds of mines planted there by the North Koreans because they must have suspected that we were going to come in with some kind of a landing. And so we had to stop, and the convoy that we were in had to just kind of circle around this area while minesweepers came in and swept the mine area for line. The first minesweeper was a Japanese minesweeper, and it hit one of the mines, and with such force it just destroyed the minesweeper, and they lost the whole crew. The second one was an American minesweeper, and the same thing happened to it. But they were able to send in enough minesweepers in about 6 or 8 days when they were able to clear it, so we had a line. And we were told that we were going to go in up at Wonsan, which would be right here. By the time we got to Wonsan, a South Korean force on the east side of the peninsula had made its way up there, so that the North Koreans were fleeing so fast that when we landed, it was almost an administrative landing. We did very, very little resistance, and that resistance was mostly just sniper fire. Well, we kept going, and then we joined the Army and other UN forces, and kept going up the peninsula, clear up to them. And this map, although it's not very accurate, I wanted to show you. In September of 1950, this was the front line. A few months later, the blue line at the top indicates the line in November of 1950, so we've come a long way. And you notice that some of the troops are actually practically to the Yalu River. And that was the borderline between North Korea and China. And that was on November 15th. President Truman flew over to Japan to meet with General MacArthur, and General MacArthur told him he was very pleased with the way the war was going, and he predicted that the fighting would be over by Thanksgiving, which is just 8 days away, and that the boys would be home by Christmas. But it turned out, and of course, incidentally, President Truman was very happy to hear that word. And when he got back to Washington, he held a press conference and told the press what General MacArthur told him, and that word got back to us faster than the speed of light, because it was very good news to hear that we're almost through with the war. But on the very next day, on the 16th of November, the lead elements of 120 to 150,000 Chinese troops started to make their way across the Yalu River, positioning themselves high in the mountain on each side of the road that the UN forces were coming up on. Korea is a very mountainous country, from far north right down to almost to Busan. There's mountains right down the center of it, high rugged mountains. And so the only way that we could get up there with all our tanks, artillery, and other materials, trucks and so on, was to follow this road. And so the Chinese positioned themselves high up in the mountains, and spotter aircraft flew over those every day they could. Some days they couldn't fly that because of the weather, but when they could, they'd fly over it, and they never did see any evidence of Chinese or any enemy action. It was starting to snow very hard, and so I'm sure the tracks were covered. And the days were quite short at that time of the year, so many times people on tracks would be covered with new snow. And we believe now that the Chinese moved principally at night, and then they pull up during the day, and then so nobody saw them. Well, they got themselves into position on the night of November 27th. The Chinese started moving down off the mountains in a fierce snowstorm. We didn't have any idea they were in the area, and at about midnight or sometime after midnight, they sprung their trap. And they, with bugles blaring, Chinese shooting, shouting, yelling, throwing hand grenades, they attacked our positions wave after wave after wave. The U.S. Army group on the east side of the Chosin Reservoir, which we called it the Chosin Reservoir because that's the way it was described in Japanese maps we saw used. But we found out later it's actually called the Changjin Reservoir, but to this day we still refer to it as the Chosin Reservoir, and even many South Koreans refer to it as the Chosin Reservoir. But anyway, on the east side, the Army just got hammered, and on the west side, the Marines were hit just about as hard. It was a savage, man-to-man type of fighting that lasted all night long. There were some lulls during the night when the Chinese would pull back to reorganize, and then they would attack again with wave after wave hitting us. During the night, most of our positions held their own, but during the night it became obvious that our Marine Division was cut into 4 different segments, and that's exactly what the Chinese were trying to do, is break us into segments so that we could be annihilated one group at a time. And for a time it looked like that was going to happen. But our leaders decided that we would, the elements that were the farthest north would turn around and start attacking south so that we could regroup into one organization instead of having 4 segments of the division. I might also add that the Marine Division consists of about 15,000 people. We also had an Army regiment with us, there was 2,000 people, and a group of British Royal Marines of about 1,000 people. So we had about 18,000 people fighting against about 150,000 people. So, and they just seemed to have no concern about life when they would make an assault. They just didn't seem to care. But after that first night, and the next morning, we counted our dead and tried to take care of our wounded, and then started assaulting south. The Chinese did everything to keep us from rejoining each other. So we had to sometimes, we could tell where the Chinese were because they were holding an area which was very difficult for us to get by. And so we knew kind of where they were. So we would have to send a company up on the mountains. And we would send a company. You could see how sharp the terrain is there that we were going on. And this is a picture of a company, and to be honest with you, I don't know whether we would have survived if we hadn't had the weather on our side. Because as cold as it was, 20 to 30 degrees below zero, we were doing much better than the Chinese. The Chinese were kind of what you might call a peasant army, in that they traveled on foot with no pieces of large equipment, no tank, no truck, no artillery pieces. Each Chinese soldier was required to carry a heavy load of ammunition, supplies, food, anything that an army would need for an extended operation for a period of time. So they were carrying very heavy loads, and they were dressed in a kind of a padded uniform, white padded uniform, and they wore when I was a boy, we used to call tennis shoes. They were a canvas sneaker type of thing, from the cold weather. So it was very difficult for them. And these blizzardous conditions we see here, we could scarcely see our own troops 25 to 50 feet ahead of us. So we were able to go up behind the Chinese, come down on them, and knock them out of this position, which prevented us from joining up against our other units. We had to do this several times during the night and during the day, but most cases it was successful, and we finally were able to rejoin all the units. We were then told to continue on towards Hungnam, which was a port city where we would be evacuated. The distance from the Chosin Reservoir to Hungnam was about 70 miles, and it took us about 12 to 14 days to make this trip. During the day, the Chinese very seldom attacked us, and so we could make good travel. Then you can see the troops up on the road there, and the mountain going actually straight up and down below, and so we've had the big bank, and this is the same group a little farther on the road. We also have real problems at certain places. During the day, they wouldn't attack, but you hit us with sniper fire for and their idea was to try to knock out trucks and tanks, and principally trucks and jeeps and small vehicles, because whenever they knock out one, they would stop the convoy until we could push it off the road. And they like to try to hit the radiators of vehicles so that they could tell when they hit them, because the antifreeze would pour out on that frozen ground and then steam up very much, and then they knew that they'd knocked out a truck or a jeep or something. And to prevent them from hitting them, many times the jeep and truck drivers would put their vehicle in low gear and with very little acceleration, and they just kind of walk alongside of it to try to stay out of the sniper fire to keep moving. This showed a bend in the road, And you can see how sharp the mound went up above it, and then went up for it seemed like it never ended. As far as you can see, this mound looked like this. The Chinese could get in those crevasses with rifle grenades, with little rocket grenades, with bazooka type thing, and shoot down on the road and hit some of the vehicles, like the trucks and so on. In this particular case, the Chinese stopped our convoy 6 or 8 times at this one point, because you can see how narrow the road is up ahead, and then there's a vehicle up ahead that had to stop because we didn't want to make another break in the convoy. And then when we had to wait for something to be a large vehicle like a tank retriever or something like that was big enough vehicle that could get up here to move this truck and these vehicles out of the way so we could keep moving. And it was very difficult to do because the tank retrievers were quite a wide vehicle, and on this narrow road it was almost impossible to pass other vehicles. So in this particular case we were stopped 6 or 8 times. You see several trucks in the foreground. Here is a Jeep, and it made it very difficult. We also had a lot of wounded and dead Marines to take care of. This was an abandoned building, and we made an emergency first aid station out of it. And the people in the foreground that you can't see very well here were dead Marines that had been killed and were just covered with the carpet. The ones up against the wall were wounded Marines that were waiting for a truck or something to come by. We could put 15 or 20 people in a truck, and that's why most of them were evacuated. If they were very seriously wounded, when the weather would break, the engineers made a small landing strip, and they were able to evacuate some of the most seriously wounded by air. When we were coming out, we tried to take all of our wounded and as many of our dead as possible. This is a picture of a truck carrying probably 15 to 20, maybe 25 to 30 dead Marines. We found that certainly shortly after a Marine was killed, and in that cold weather he was frozen solid, and so we just piled them in the truck like cordwood and loaded them up. And in this particular case, the truck was loaded, but they went by a couple more dead Marines, and so they piled them up on top of the load and tied them down. And so it wasn't unusual to see many trucks loaded with wounded, another truck right behind it just loaded with a whole load of dead Marines. We did capture a lot of Chinese, and although this picture doesn't show it very well, this Chinese soldier's foot was just black because it was frozen so bad. When we capture, when we were making assaults, many times we'd capture a number of Chinese, and we found we would always ask them to raise their hand. And when they'd raise their hands, we could see the ends of their fingers were just black and frostbite, and their feet were frozen clear up to their ankles. They were black in many cases. And so they suffered far more than we did. Another picture of a Marine, of a whole bunch of Koreans, Chinese that we captured. And I didn't see a single one in any of the prisoners who we captured that had a pair of gloves. They always just stuck their hands in their arms like this, on opposite sleeves. And many of them threw away these canvas sneakers and just wrapped cloths around their feet to try to keep them from freezing. So we really had the advantage as far as the weather was concerned. Well, we finally made it. After about 14 days, we made it to Hungnam. We were transported back down to the southern part of Korea, where we regrouped and started the battle back up the peninsula for the second time. This time it went a little slower because in addition to fighting North Koreans, we're fighting Chinese this time. And so it took longer, But over the next year or so, we were able to battle our way back up to the 38th parallel, and then for almost 2 years, it was almost a stalemate in which there was peace negotiations that would come and go and fall apart and come back together and so on. And during that time, there were some terrific battles and some very bad skirmishes, and where whole platoons would be wiped out and on both sides of the line. So it was very difficult. But finally, the peace negotiators got together, and although they didn't have a peace treaty of any kind, they did have a ceasefire, which means that 75 years later, technically China, North and South Korea are still at war, but they do have a ceasefire that is held more or less for this last 75 years. This is a picture of what the demilitarized zone looks like. This is the 38th parallel, and the demilitarized zone is a strip 160 miles long from coast to coast, and it's about 5 miles wide, with the demarcation line right in the center. That meant that the North Koreans could go into the DMZ to the demarcation line, but couldn't cross it. Likewise, the South Koreans could go into the demarcation on the into the DMZ on the south side, but they couldn't cross the line. At Panmunjom, where these peace negotiations took place, they're still in use. The building in the back there is a North Korean building, and then to my back, when I was taking this picture, was a South Korean building. And these blue buildings in the foreground are where the peace negotiations take place. You may have seen these in the news this week, because Kim Jong-un had asked that we have a meeting because he wanted to send some people in to the South Korean Olympics, which are going to be in another month. So they did have another meeting, and that was considered a real start for getting some treaty or some talks going, and so that's where it stands right now. But the South Korean are alert 24/7, and if you look across on the other side, you see the North Koreans looking back at you. When I was there, I've been there a couple of times. I was there about 2 or 3 months ago, and they always caution you, don't make any obscene gestures, don't yell at them, don't do anything, because you don't want to start up anything. Another picture of the DMC. I showed you a city block that was being taken over by the U.S. Forces, by the Marines in Korea in 1950. And this is a picture of the same city block, and this is the same building that was on the corner. And today, everything has been changed. In the last 65 years, you can't believe what Korea has done. At the end of World War II, I'll just backtrack just a second here. Most of you probably realize or knew that the Imperial Japan ruled Korea from 1910 to the end of the war, 1945. During that time, they just didn't occupy it. They wrote the laws, enforced the laws. They were very abusive to men, and as you know, you've heard of what the Japanese soldiers did to the Korean women. They used them for comfort women, and as a result, Korea didn't progress very much during that 35 years. So if you had a list of third world countries at the end of World War II, I think you would see that Korea was near the bottom of the list, because it just hadn't progressed at all. And during that 65 years since then, it's become actually kind of a world power. We all see the Korean automobiles like the Kia and the Hyundai that are here. We see brands like LG, which I understand stands for living good, in refrigerators, television sets, and everything. And if this group was probably divided with your cell phones, you'd probably find almost half of you are carrying Samsung cell phones, which are all made in Korea. And so Korea has really progressed in the last few years. Another picture this is the palace today. They completely redid it. All the buildings that were torn down are very good. The city of Seoul today is a city of almost 12 million people, and it's a very modern city. And housing is very important there because of so many people living in the city. They're building, these were 15-story apartment buildings, and while I was there, there were cranes all over the city building 35-story apartment buildings, even closer together than these are, just for housing for the Koreans. So it's really hard. And one more picture. I wanted to show you a picture, a satellite picture taken by a U.S. satellite in June of 2017, taken at night. With any light showing, the more intense light would be kind of red, and the less intense might be yellow, and the still less would be light blue, and no light at all might be. And this is a picture of South Korea, and this is a picture of North Korea. And above North Korea, above the Yalu River, that border there is China. So you can see how much South Korea's advanced compared to North Korea. Well, that's the Korean War as I saw it, and I think that you'll find that we're going to see more and more of South Korea. When I was there 2 months ago, I asked a number of people, what do you think about North Korea? Are you very concerned about it? Because when I was there, it was just at the time that North Korea launched a missile that went over the actually more in the northern part of Japan and landed in the Pacific. And they said, we're very worried, but there just simply cannot be war. And war would just bring chaos there. North Korea has so many artillery pieces north of the DMZ, and 50% of the population of South Korea is within artillery fire of the north. So they can wipe out Seoul, and 50% of the population of South Korea in just a short time with conventional artillery shells, to say nothing about atomic bombs. So hopefully these peace negotiations will take place and we won't have any problems like this. And I think it's really important that both Kim Jong-un and President Trump hold back in any way they can. I'm sorry I probably take a little more time than I should have here, but I appreciate it and thank you very much. Well, one question over here. Oh. I was asked to tell a story about the Tootsie Roll.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
When we were coming out of the reservoir, it was so cold that all of our rations were frozen solid. You couldn't break into some of those cans of meatballs and spaghetti with a bayonet or a K-bar or any type of knife. They were just frozen so solid. And we were living on the things that we could eat on the rations, like the crackers and things like that, which wasn't very much. When we were coming out, our 60-millimeter mortar sections ran short of cells. And as you know, in wartime, everything has a code name. And the code name for 60-millimeter mortar shells was Tootsie Roll. So we ordered Tootsie Rolls. And lo and behold, dispatcher at the end was new at the job, and so he said, the Marines want Tootsie Roll. So the next shipment, the next airdrop that came in, we thought was going to be mortar shells, and it turned out to be Tootsie Roll. But it turned out to be a lifesaver because Tootsie Rolls were, even though they were frozen, you could break them in half and put them in your mouth, and they'd soon soften up. They would, you could put them in your parka coat, and your body temperature would warm them up so you could eat them. So we lived on those Tootsie Rolls for several days when we were coming out of the reservoir. And then we also found there were other uses. I told you about the Chinese would like to shoot out the radiators of our vehicle. We found out that if you take a roll of soft Tootsie Roll and push it into the hole of the radiator, it would stop the leak from quite some time. And so, Tootsie Rolls were very, very important there.
Was Chesty Puller around your area?
He asked if Chesty Puller was my area. No, I was in a different group. The only conversation I ever had with Chesty Puller was this. When we got down near Hungnam, they put out some kind of boxes with holes in them that were used for toilets. And I was using one, and Chesty Puller came up and sat by me, and he said, "How you doing, son?" And I said, "Pretty good, sir. How you doing?" He said, "It was a hell of a fight, wasn't it?" And I said, "Yes, it was." And he said, "Carry on," something. So I did my duty, he did his. That's what I know about Chesty Puller.
My brother was his radio man.
He was a very good leader, yeah. He was.
Bob was his radio man.
He's the only Marine I know of that has five Navy crosses. He really deserves a Medal of Honor, but he never get that. Okay, thank you very much.
Had a chance to spend a little time with Dick over coffee.